Jay, and welcome to Video Synthesis Tarot. So this is a series where I'm going to be talking about various tarot concepts and working with video synthesis techniques and talking about the links between them. So this might seem arbitrary and absurd to some folks, and I, can't deny that if that's what you're feeling, that's definitely like a legitimate feeling. But bear with me, because there are some links to general scale occult knowledge and video synthesis. This is something I'll also be talking about with my friend Juana and many of our guests in my other program, Mathemagical Motifs. But this is sort of a more low-key kind of jam-out scenario than that show. So I thought it would be nice to have multiple avenues to discuss these things. But roughly speaking, in a very broad way, what a lot of esoteric practice and what tarot in specific seems to me to be heavily about is about nonverbal semiotic communication. And the link between that and video synthesis seems obvious when you put it that way, because something that I feel is remarkably unique and amazing about video synthesis is that we have the ability to sort of real-time have real-time control over abstract visual medium in a way that can very strongly affect communication of messages, and not just communication in the sort of standard narrative way where you just have like a camera pointed at someone and they're doing something and you see like activity and whatnot, but communication in a much more deep and abstract way where you're talking about the way that colors communicate things, the way that shapes communicate things, because humans think in terms of, we have multiple levels to how we think. There's one level which is verbal, and this verbal level we tend to think of as being I. We tend to like associate our verbalization and our stream of consciousness with words as being, this is who I am, this is what I am. But humans are much more than just words. Like, we have a lot going on in our nervous systems and in our physical systems as a whole, which is completely nonverbal, which is not really directly accessible through words. And much magic and much video synthesis is really about how do we sort of understand our nonverbal aspects, how do we understand sort of the symbols that we use, what symbols, whether they are culturally accepted symbols or whether they're sort of these like symbols which are like innate to our brains. Like, if you think about it, like fear of snakes and fear of spiders, that's not a cultural thing. Fear of snakes and spiders is very much like, that's just inside of our brains somehow. That's inside of our DNA. That's like communicated at a very low level. I'm not saying that every single human ever has like innate fear of snakes, because there's a lot of random things that can happen, and there isn't really like a one-size-fits-all blueprint for like talking about human experience works, but it does seem, if you look at it, that the vast majority of humans, regardless of culture, have this sort of like, they see like the shape of the spider or the shape of the snake and they're like, ugh, I don't like that. Whereas opposed to something like, if you think about how wolves are viewed and how wild dogs are viewed in many cultures, there's sort of a lot of that's somewhat more culturally specific if you look at it, because sometimes wolves are villains and wolves are things you don't want to be around. Wolves are going to eat you and kill you and trick you and dress up in your grandma's clothes. That's kind of a weird one if you think about wolf dressing up, killing your grandmother and dressing up in their clothes. But in other cultures, you have like coyotes. Other cultures that didn't really have so many wolves, they have coyotes as like they're sort of like more of that motif. We'll think of that as like more of a beneficial character. In a lot of Plains Native Americans mythology and folklore, coyote is, not exactly a hero, but they are not like a figure to be feared or a figure of evil. They're sort of more of like the technology trickster, like goofball wizard god character. So that's sort of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about how like humans communicate in symbols. Like you don't really need you don't really need words necessarily to understand that like coyotes are kind of tricky and like funny. You just can like watch a coyote like hunting, or watch coyotes and their families like playing with their pups and whatnot, and you can like see what's going on. But yeah, let's get over to the tarot a little bit more. I understand that the focus is a little bit wonky on this whole thing, and maybe I'll fix this in further episodes, but this is what I got to work with today. So the tarot I'm going to be working with mainly is the Thoth Tarot, which is designed by Lady Frida Harris and Aleister Crowley together. And this is sort of my favorite of the decks that I have, that I've worked with, simply because it really works. It's very, very much heavily about color and geometry, and these sort of working with like multiple planes, which I find really, really nifty. So you look, the first card here I have is Fortune, and that's really the last thing, like the last word we should try to use to identify this. So if you want to think about it more abstractly, just sort of like take it in as a shape. And the video synthesis may be helping or harming this, I don't know. Maybe it's like distracting you enough so you're not using words as much as you might be. Maybe my terrible lighting is screwing things up too. But let's think about the symbols that we see on here. So the wheel is primary, right in the center, and we have a number of stars in this really sort of intricate, sort of askew geometrical progression up above everything. And I think I don't want to ever say this is it, like this is like the actual definition of something, because that's not really what like magic or tarot is about. They're about interpretation and context. So everything I say is about reflecting my interpretation and my context. And it's also about interpreting things together. One of the most interesting things about tarot is that we can use these sort of combinations of images, the emotions that the colors make us feel, the sort of qualities of like what we identify as objects, a wheel, a sphinx, some sort of like little monkey creature, and a crocodile monster. Like, what do these things sort of mean? And what is, like, why is there this kind of like swirling pattern here around? Why is there this like askew, different sort of projective geometry of the stars above everything? And these aren't really answers that you have like one answer to. They mean different things in different contexts. And everything I'm saying is really just, it's coming from where my context is. So none of this is law. Nobody is a law unto, no one is really able to like define anyone else's context, is what I'm saying. But on one hand, you can just think about the colors and just meditate on the colors and how the colors and the shapes sort of like resonate within you. And the masterful use of color, space, and geometry in these is sort of my favorite part of it. Because this one has this sort of like, the Fortune has this jumping golden yellow foreground with a sort of azure and indigo background, which just like stands out quite lovely. But within that, we have the Fortune. So if you think about what does a wheel mean, a wheel is something which turns. So a wheel always comes back to where it was at some point. And the wheel is also moving. Like a wheel is either attached to some sort of vehicle, which is moving to a direction, or it's attached to a mill of some sort or a machine. So it's mechanically moving something. It's a process. A wheel is how you get somewhere. It's not about the destination. It's about the process of movement. And it's also about cycles, because the wheel always comes back to one spot. Like no matter what point you are at on the wheel, you can always know that it's going to cycle around and come back to that. And on this wheel, we have these three figures. We have a sphinx, And we have Hermanubis, this little monkey guy over here. And we have Typhon, who is the crocodile god over there. So these are sort of three like positions, three broad sort of categories for like where this sort of wheel of fate could be at any point in time. Like the Sphinx is a sort of abstract, distant, non-human wisdom and judgment. And then the Hermanubis is sort of a form of similar to Hermes, sort of an intelligence god, sort of a trickster god, like kind of a playful character, but they're more as they're represented more by like a monkey figure here. You should think more of monkeys, like think more of like what does the archetype of a monkey mean in human brains, and that's sort of this like they're similar to us, and they're just kind of like shadows of humans in some sort of a way, where they seem to have the same motivations. They seem to like to play. They like to like have social activities. They're very like family driven, but they're also just kind of off. They're not humans, but they're close enough. And then down at the bottom you have Typhon. Typhon is this is more of the Egyptian interpretation of Typhon, but in Greek mythology, Typhon was kind of like a titan, a monster, someone who challenged Zeus, the sky god, who like the god of patriarchy before Christianity came around, and they were kind of a representation of like chaos and like natural disasters, like a whirlpool, a hurricane, a tornado, an earthquake. But they're not just pure destruction. They're sort of playful destruction in a way too, because they have a really good time with it, and they're not human, and they're not really like a human god so much. They're sort of outside of like this kind of idea of like morality or good or bad. They're more about just kind of like existing and in a kind of like destructive way and just kind of like reveling in it. So they're not necessarily evil, they're sort of amoral destruction, if that makes sense. So that's sort of these three categories of where your fortune can be, where the wheel of fortune can be at any moment. But the important thing to think about is that these things always move from one into another. They're always changing. And the important thing to take away from fortune is flux. It's the idea that nothing stays the same, everything changes, but also within that constant change, there is a cycling, and the same shapes and the same patterns will show up again. You see that a lot in video feedback, where things are just constantly moving, things are all over the place, but there's sort of these same sets of motifs that you'll see coming up over and over again. And video feedback itself is a really perfect example of the Wheel of Fortune, because video feedback is sort of like, it's more so, it's a bit more on like the Typhon style of where you're at, where it's kind of destructive, like it sort of destroys the image that you feed it into it, that you're using as a seed, but it's sort of doing it in like a really enjoyable and fun way. It seems to be sort of reveling in the destruction, and it's like creating something new from the destruction, which is an also important part of sort of the Typhon concept, is creativity and destruction and playfulness. And then after that, we have the Prince of Wands here. The Prince of Wands is, so princes are air, and the wands are fire. So Prince of Wands sort of means heir of fire. And we can think about air and fire as both being these kind of like abstract ideas of sort of like abstract intellect, which would be air, and then in some ways fire is like another sort of like volatile, quick, powerful, destructive, but destructive in a different sort of way from Typhon. Fire is destructive in that it is something that like destroys, but also something that is like very, very important. If you want to eat food, fire is pretty crucial. If you want to do any sort of smithing, if you want to do any kind of metalworking, fire is very important. And if you don't want to freeze to death in the extreme northern or extreme southern hemisphere, fire is really important. So fire is kind of like it's an important technology, but it's something you need to be kind of like you just need to be kind of concerned with it. You can think of it sort of being like technology in general. Like all technology that we have is helpful in the right context and harmful in the wrong contexts. The Prince of Wands, in particular, seems like a very sort of extreme individual. You can see they're moving incredibly quickly. All of the sort of like motion, there's this very sharp and intense motion everywhere about them. You can practically feel that they're just like zooming right in at you, like the feedback is right now. And this is sort of what I'm talking about, where we can use video synthesis and video feedback to sort of accentuate and communicate things. Using the zooming in on the wave pool a lot to sort of create this sort of intense feeling, and I'm amplifying the reds a lot because that's kind of where we're at. So one thing we can learn from this Prince of Wands is we want to communicate this feeling of intense emotions and quick decision makings and things sort of like abruptly, violently like happening. We can grab this motif of lunging out at you. Everything sort of like having one perspective point that like is really forcing its way out. Oop, I lost the red. Let's get back there. Other things you can see is that there is a lion pulling this chariot. You can think about, what does a lion mean as an abstract symbol. Lions are proud, they're majestic, they are aggressive. There's the whole sort of concept of the lion as being king of the animals. And lions are also a symbol of the sun because of their mane and their coloration too, a little bit. I suppose if we had a different colored sun, just think about like how much of our symbols would be different. Something I like to think about is, what kind of mythology would people have on different planets? Or when people start to live in space stations for extended periods of time, what kind of mythology will you develop after like 400 years on a space station? How will that transform whatever kind of religions people bring with them there? Fun stuff. Yeah. And the chariot is important. Well, all of the princes have chariots and steeds, but this one in particular, you can see the chariot itself is on fire and like has these sort of like jagged crystalline fire structures like at their forefront. And they have a crown, which has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 points. And above the crown seems to be some sort of an owl or a falcon. See, I'm not using like references for these. The fun thing about tarot is there's a lot of books on various tarots. There's like this book in particular, which a lot of people like to use if they're using the Thoth Tarot. But tarot is a book. Like the each one of these cards is a narrative, and it's telling you things that you don't really need. Like you can think of these as being like cheat sheets, but all they're really telling you is what one person thought these things. Even though Aleister Crowley helped design these cards, they don't, they're not like the authority on them. Like, if you're using whatever deck you're using at any moment, you are the authority on that deck. So, and you and the cards together are making these stories happen. Wow, the autofocus on this camera is just hot trash. Look at it. Yes. And then the final card here is, so we've got another wand. So this was the Prince of Wands. Something to think about is whenever you have multiple cards from the same suit together, you definitely want to start thinking about the qualities of that suit. Wands are how a magician or a wizard or a magus or what have you. I'm not sure if those are gender-neutral words or not. It's how a practitioner, although the wand is not exactly a gender-neutral symbol either. Wands are how a practitioner of the arcane arts makes their will sort of like felt in the world. A wand is what you use to sort of achieve something in this sort of like magical realm. So that's what wands seem to symbolize to me. And you've got this card here, which is 9 of Wands. Let me get this. All right. So the wands here are arrows. So they're not just something you hold in your hand and use to, like, you know, cast your energy out into the world. They are something which is being shot out, and you shoot them out at something. But the tips of these arrows are all little lunar symbols. The wand itself in the middle starts from a lunar symbol, and it goes up to a solar symbol. Let me see if I can get the glare right in there. There we go. So the wands themselves are talking about strength. They are arranged in a very nice pattern here where they're weaving. These are all right angles where the wands are interacting. So this sort of is talking about patterns and cohesion. When you see a cohesive pattern, like, that's what it's saying. Like, this is kind of what I'm saying about, if you look at this kind of a pattern, we can get this a little bit more. Ooh. See if we can get something a little bit more patterny going on. I'm gonna have to maybe fix some of the strobing on this one too. So when we have these kind of patterns, they communicate something very, very different from that sort of red, fiery feeling we had earlier. We have these intricate, locked, parallel lines, which just registers as, it can register as like sort of various kinds of depth fields in our mind. The way that the rigid patterns sort of like unfold and morph, you can see that the rigid patterns break down at a certain point and they become these like sort of more organic textures. So that communicates something in and of itself. And you can look at this lineup here of cards where we have change, we have impetuous, fiery movement, and we have this sort of strong crystalline lattice. And think about how to combine all of these things into a video synthesis patch. So we had the fiery movement earlier. We have this sort of strong crystalline structure happening. So let's try to bring back in some of this fiery movement. We got some fire. Let's add a little bit more color so that we have the sensation of movement. And add a little bit more delay in here. Let's start to sort of shift these things around. So now we have this combination of constant flux. Everything's moving around. There's a strong sense of pattern happening, strong sense of unity, but the patterns themselves are sort of devolving. I don't know if devolving is the right word. They're mutating into a warm, intense, fast, speed it up a little bit, faster pattern that is like thrusting out at you. And that's what video art tarot is all about. And I think that'll be the end of this episode. And we'll see you for the next time when we talk more about how to communicate without language. Let me know in the comments if there's anything you'd like to see me cover in these future episodes. And as always, have fun.